Alright, so here goes. I'm not one to share my life story, but looking back, it's kind of insane how things turned out. I'm 26 now, a millionaire, and living a life I couldn't even dream of back when I was just a kid from a nowhere town. But to understand how I got here, you've got to know where it all started. Let me take you back to when I was 17. I grew up in a tiny town on the outskirts of New York. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and news travels faster than the wind. My mom, Linda, was the hardest working woman I've ever known. After my dad passed away in a car accident when I was 11, she held our little family together. Me, her, and my older sister, Katie. Mom worked 2 jobs, one at the local diner and another at the supermarket. Katie, who was 19 at the time, had just started working part-time at the same supermarket. She was the responsible one, always trying to lighten Mom's load. Me? I was the kid who lived in the garage. Cars were my escape. My dad had been a mechanic, and he passed that love down to me. Even before I hit double digits, I was in that garage, tinkering with tools, taking things apart just to put them back together. After he died, I made it my mission to keep his spirit alive through that garage. It became my sanctuary. When life got tough, and trust me, it often did, I'd bury myself in an engine, drowning out the world with the sound of metal and grease. High school, though, was hell. Being a car kid didn't win you any popularity points. I was the scrawny kid with grease under his nails, the one everyone called Garage Rat. Most days, I'd get shoved into lockers or have my lunch tray, accidentally, knocked over. There was this one guy, Tyler, who made it his life's mission to make mine miserable. I still remember him dumping a can of soda over my head in the cafeteria while everyone laughed. The worst part? Katie saw it happen and looked like she wanted to murder him, but she couldn't do anything. She was tough, but she taught me to pick my battles. I didn't blame her for walking away, though. We were both just trying to survive. Despite the bullying, the one thing that kept me going was cars. I'd spend every free moment in that garage or down at the local service station. The owner, Joe, was an old friend of my dad's, and he'd let me help out for a few bucks under the table. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy car parts from the junkyard and keep my projects going. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a sweltering August afternoon. I was in Joe's service station, elbows deep in a busted-up Chevy, when I heard it. The growl of an engine that made my heart skip a beat. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped outside to see a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz S-Class roll into town. Now, you've got to understand, in our little town, the nicest car you'd usually see was a rusted Ford pickup. So, seeing that Benz was like spotting a unicorn. The car pulled up to the service station, and out stepped this guy who looked like he belonged in a magazine. He was in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than our entire house. His name, as I later found out, was Charles Blake. The man radiated wealth. But here's the kicker. His fancy car wouldn't start. Apparently, it had been acting up since he left the city, and no one in town had been able to figure out what was wrong. Joe scratched his head, muttering something about modern cars being too complicated. I could see Charles getting impatient, so I stepped in. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Charles raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead, kid." I popped the hood, and my heart started racing. This car was a masterpiece, a symphony of engineering. Within minutes, I spotted the issue: a faulty sensor in the engine control unit. It was a simple fix, something I'd read about in one of my car magazines. I patched it up, and the engine roared to life. Charles looked at me like I just performed a magic trick. "You did that?" he asked, incredulous. I nodded, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, it was just a sensor. Nothing major." He grinned and clapped me on the back. "Kid, you've got talent. What's your name?" "Michael," I said, barely able to contain my excitement. "Well, Michael, you just saved me a ton of hassle." "Thank you." He handed me a crisp $100 bill, and I swear I'd never seen that much money in one place before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Fixing that car had been the highlight of my life, and for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't destined to rot in that small town. Little did I know, that moment was just the beginning. About a month later, I was back at Joe's, working on a beat-up Dodge that looked like it had been through a war zone. when a sleek black SUV rolled into the lot. I wiped my hands on my ever-greasy jeans, expecting another customer with a mundane issue, but then the passenger door opened, and out stepped a sharply dressed woman in her mid-30s. She carried an air of authority that made you stand up a little straighter without even realizing it. "Michael, right?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. I nodded, suddenly aware of how messy I looked. "That's me. My name's Amanda. I work for Charles Blake. He was very impressed with the work you did on his car last month." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Charles Blake? The guy with the bins? I thought that was a one-and-done kind of deal. "Okay," I said slowly, unsure where this was going. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made you feel like something big was about to happen. "He's looking for someone like you. Someone with raw talent and a good head on their shoulders. He wants to offer you a job." My jaw nearly hit the floor. "A job?" "Yes," she said, her tone patient but firm. "As a mechanic, initially. But there's potential for much more if you prove yourself. He's willing to pay well." "Very well." I glanced over at Joe, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, a proud but slightly wistful look on his face. He'd always been like a second father to me, and I suddenly felt a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving. I'd have to think about it," I stammered. Amanda's smile didn't waver. "Of course. Talk it over with your family. But just so you know, this is a rare opportunity. Charles doesn't offer jobs like this to just anyone." She handed me a business card with her name and number on it. "Give me a call when you're ready." As the SUV drove away, Joe walked over and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You've got something special, kid. Don't waste it." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Mom and Katie, the card burning a hole in my pocket. I told them everything, from the moment Charles rolled into town to Amanda's visit earlier that day. Mom listened quietly, her face unreadable, while Katie's eyes lit up with excitement. "You have to take it, Michael," Katie said. "This could change everything for us." Mom, however, was less convinced. "It's a big decision," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "And it's not just about the money. You'd be leaving everything behind. Your friends, your family." I wanted to argue, but the truth was, she had a point. Leaving meant stepping into a completely unknown world, one that seemed almost too good to be true. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I called Amanda, and before I knew it, I was packing my bags for a new life. As I hugged Mom and Katie goodbye, I promised them that I'd come back for them one day, that I'd make sure we all got out of this town for good. Little did I know, that promise would shape everything that happened next. The day I arrived at Charles Blake's estate was like stepping into another universe. Amanda had arranged for a car to pick me up, and as we drove through the massive iron gates, my jaw practically unhinged. The driveway alone was longer than the main street in my town, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and towering oaks. At the end of it stood a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. White columns, massive windows, and a fountain in the middle of a circular driveway. Amanda met me at the front steps, her professional demeanor as sharp as ever. "Welcome, Michael," she said, gesturing toward the house. "This will be your new home." Home felt like an overstatement. My entire house could have fit into the foyer alone, with its marble floors and chandeliers that probably cost more than my mom's yearly income. I was so busy gawking that I almost didn't hear Amanda explaining my quarters. "You'll have your own room in the guest house," she said, leading me outside and down a stone path to a smaller, yet equally luxurious building. "You'll start in the garage as Charles's personal mechanic. If you perform well, there may be room for advancement." "Got it," I managed, trying to act like I wasn't completely overwhelmed. The garage, though, that's where I felt at home. It wasn't a garage so much as a showroom. Polished concrete floors, walls lined with tools I'd only ever seen in catalogs, and a fleet of cars that made my heart race. A Lamborghini, a vintage Porsche, and of course, the Mercedes I'd fixed. "Think you can handle it?" Amanda asked with a knowing smirk. I grinned. "Yeah, I think I can." The first few weeks were a whirlwind. Every day brought a new challenge, tuning up engines, detailing luxury interiors, and even learning the intricate computer systems that ran most of these cars. Charles didn't hover, but he'd occasionally pop into the garage to check on my progress. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon, watching me fine-tune the Lamborghini's suspension. "I knew I made the right choice bringing you here." Those words stuck with me. For the first time in my life, someone believed in me, not just as a kid with potential, but as someone capable of great things. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The other staff, drivers, housekeepers, and groundskeepers weren't exactly welcoming. Most of them had been with Charles for years and saw me as a kid who didn't belong. "Don't let them get to you," Amanda said one evening after I vented about a particularly rude driver who'd called me a grease monkey. "You're here because you earned it. Prove them wrong." So I did. I worked harder, stayed later, and learned faster than anyone expected. Slowly but surely, I started earning their respect. About 6 months in, Charles called me into his office, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate. "I've been watching you," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "You're more than just a mechanic, Michael. You've got ambition, and I like that. How would you feel about becoming my personal driver?" I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Driver? Like full-time?" He nodded. "You'll need to get your license for luxury vehicles, but I'll cover the costs. The job comes with a significant pay raise and, frankly, a lot more responsibility. Think you're up for it?" Was I up for it? Hell, yes. The next few weeks were intense. I spent hours in driving schools, learning how to handle everything from Bentleys to armored SUVs. It wasn't just about driving. It was about mastering precision, timing, and discretion. There were moments I doubted myself, like the time I clipped a curb during a parallel parking drill and the instructor gave me a death glare. But I pushed through. Every mistake was a lesson, and every lesson brought me closer to my goal. By the time I passed my final test, I felt like I could take on the world. When I officially started as Charles's driver, it was like stepping into another layer of his life. I drove him to meetings in Manhattan skyscrapers, private events at country clubs, and even the occasional weekend getaway to the Hamptons. But it wasn't just about driving. I became Charles's confidant. He'd talk to me during rides, sharing bits of wisdom about business, life, and success. "Never let anyone tell you your dreams are too big," he said once as we cruised down the highway. "People told me I'd never make it out of the Bronx, and now look where I am." His words resonated with me. For the first time, I started to believe that I could do more than just survive. I could thrive. Driving Charles Blake wasn't just a job. It was a masterclass in how the world of the elite operated. Every trip offered a front-row seat to power plays and whispered deals. I'd sit in the driver's seat, pretending not to listen, while Charles closed million-dollar deals or negotiated contracts that could change entire industries. It was exhilarating and intimidating all at once. But as my world expanded, so did the weight on my shoulders. I didn't forget where I came from, though. Every paycheck brought a little more stability to my family back home. The first thing I did was pay off all of Mom's debts. The look on her face when I handed her the receipt for the mortgage balance? I'll never forget it. "You didn't have to do this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I did," I replied. "You've done everything for us. It's time I do something for you." Katie was next. She'd been juggling night classes while working full-time at the supermarket, trying to better herself. I sent her enough money to cover her tuition, with a little extra to make sure she didn't have to kill herself working overtime. She called me the moment she saw the transfer. "Michael, what is this?" "It's a thank you," I said, "for everything you've done for me and Mom." She tried to argue, but I wouldn't hear it. "You deserve this, Katie. Take it." Life in Charles's world wasn't without its challenges. The hours were long, the expectations high, and the stakes even higher. One slip-up, one late arrival, or minor mistake, and I risked losing everything I'd built. There was one night I'll never forget. Charles had an important gala in the city, and I'd mapped out the route down to the second. But New York traffic has a way of laughing at your plans. We hit gridlock on the FDR Drive, and I could feel Charles's frustration rising in the back seat. He didn't yell. Charles never yelled, but the tension was suffocating. "Any ideas, Michael?" he asked, his tone sharp. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Then I spotted an exit. "Hang on," I said, cutting the wheel and veering off onto a side street. What followed was a white-knuckle race through the city's backroads, dodging potholes and weaving through narrow alleys. By some miracle, we arrived at the venue with minutes to spare. As I opened the door for Charles, he stepped out and turned to me with a rare smile. "Well done, Michael. You saved the day." It was the first time I truly felt like I belonged. One evening, as I was polishing the Bentley, Amanda walked into the garage, her usually composed face clouded with concern. "Michael," she said, "do you have a moment?" "Of course," I replied, setting down the polishing cloth. "There's something you should know," she began, hesitating for the first time since I'd met her. "Your sister, Katie, called the office. She didn't want to worry you, but your mom's health has been declining." My heart dropped. "What? Why didn't she tell me?" "She didn't want to distract you," Amanda said gently, "but I thought you'd want to know." I thanked her and immediately called Katie. She tried to downplay it, but I could hear the worry in her voice. Mom had been pushing herself too hard, trying to keep the house spotless and take on odd jobs despite me sending money. "She doesn't want to feel useless," Katie explained. I felt a surge of guilt. Here I was, living in luxury, while Mom was running herself into the ground. The next weekend, I drove back to my hometown, determined to set things right. Walking into our old house felt surreal. The peeling wallpaper, the creaky floors. It was a stark reminder of how far I'd come. Mom tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see the exhaustion etched into her face. "You're doing too much," I told her. "You don't have to prove anything to me or Katie. Let us take care of you for once." She brushed me off, as stubborn as ever, but I didn't let up. By the time I left, I'd hired a cleaning service and a part-time caretaker to help her out. She wasn't happy about it, but I knew it was the right thing to do. On the drive back to Charles's estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more, not just for my family, but for myself. I'd spent so much time trying to prove I was worthy of this life that I'd forgotten to think about what I wanted out of it. That night, as I sat in my room, I started sketching out ideas for a side business, something that combined my love of cars with the skills I'd learned from Charles. It was the first step towards something bigger, though I didn't know it at the time. The days after my visit home were a blur of new responsibilities and restless nights. I couldn't shake the image of Mom's tired face or the way Katie's voice trembled when we talked about her future. For the first time in years, I felt a pull to do something bigger, not just for myself, but for the people I loved. One evening, as I was sitting in the garage at Charles's estate, staring at the lineup of luxury cars I'd maintained with pride, an idea hit me. What if I could create a business that offered high-end, personalized car restoration? Something that wasn't just about fixing engines, but about turning vehicles into works of art? I spent weeks researching and sketching plans in my free time. It felt like I was back in that small-town garage, dreaming up ways to breathe life into old, forgotten machines. The difference now was that I had resources and connections, thanks to Charles. When I finally worked up the courage to pitch the idea to him, I half expected him to laugh. Instead, he listened intently, nodding as I laid out my vision. "It's ambitious," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I like ambitious. Let's see what you can do." He offered to fund the initial startup, not as a gift, but as an investment. "You'll pay me back with interest," he said with a sly grin. "Consider it your first real business lesson." Starting the business was harder than I'd imagined. There were permits to secure, suppliers to negotiate with, and a mountain of paperwork that felt like it would never end. I worked long hours, juggling my duties as Charles's driver with my new venture. There were setbacks, too. One of the first cars we worked on, a classic Mustang, ended up with a botched paint job due to a supplier sending the wrong materials. The client wasn't happy, and I had to personally visit him to apologize and offer a discount. But with every mistake came a lesson. I hired better staff, vetted suppliers more carefully, and learned to handle clients with a level of professionalism I'd only seen from Charles. Just as things were starting to take off, trouble came knocking, literally. One night, as I was closing up the shop, I heard a loud bang outside. When I stepped out, I saw Tyler, my old high school bully, leaning against the wall with a smug grin. "Nice place you've got here, garage rat," he sneered. I hadn't seen him in years, but the memories came flooding back. The locker shoves, the cafeteria pranks, the soda can over my head. "What do you want, Tyler?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how the golden boy's doing," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Heard you're making big money now. Must be nice." It didn't take long to figure out what he was after. He hinted at being in some financial trouble and implied that I owed him for all the lessons he taught me in high school. I stared him down, my hands clenched into fists. "I don't owe you anything, Tyler. Get off my property." For a moment, I thought he might take a swing at me, but instead, he smirked and walked away, muttering something about not forgetting this. The encounter with Tyler rattled me more than I wanted to admit. It was a harsh reminder of the world I'd worked so hard to leave behind. But instead of letting it drag me down, I used it as fuel. I threw myself into the business with renewed determination. Every car we restored became a testament to how far I'd come, a middle finger to everyone who'd ever doubted me. Within a year, the shop was thriving. We had a waiting list of clients, many of them referrals from Charles's wealthy friends. I'd even started hosting weekend workshops for young mechanics, hoping to pass on some of the knowledge that had saved me. One of the proudest moments of my life came when I surprised Mom and Katie with a brand new house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was light years away from the cramped, run-down place we'd grown up in. Mom cried when she saw it, and Katie just stood there, speechless. "You didn't have to do this," Mom said, her voice breaking. "I know," I replied, "but I wanted to." It felt like everything had come full circle. For the first time, I felt like I was truly giving them the life they deserved. Life was finally falling into place. The business was thriving, my family was safe and comfortable, and I was starting to feel like the weight of the past had lifted. But as they say, life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. It started with small things. A few tools missing from the shop, a scratch on a car that hadn't been there the night before. At first, I chalked it up to accidents or forgetfulness, but then the notes began. They were scrawled on scraps of paper, left on the shop's door after hours. The messages were vague but menacing. "You don't belong here. Enjoy it while it lasts. Payback's a bitch." I had a sinking feeling I knew who was behind them, but I didn't want to believe it. One night, I caught him red-handed. Tyler. He was lurking near the shop with a crowbar in hand, clearly planning to do some damage. "Tyler!" I shouted, stepping out of the shadows. He froze, then turned to face me, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. He laughed bitterly. "What does it look like? Just leveling the playing field. You think you're better than everyone now? Huh? Just because you got lucky?" "This isn't luck," I said, my voice steady. "I worked for this. You could have done the same if you tried instead of tearing people down." "Don't lecture me," he snapped, raising the crowbar. For a moment, I thought he might actually attack, but something in my eyes must have stopped him. He dropped the crowbar and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. I didn't call the cops. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was the part of me that remembered what it felt like to be stuck in a dead-end life. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let him or anyone else jeopardize everything I'd built. Just when I thought things were settling down, another curveball came my way. One of our most high-profile projects, a fully customized Lamborghini for one of Charles's friends, was scheduled for delivery. It was the kind of job that could make or break our reputation. The night before the delivery, I stayed late at the shop, double-checking every detail. That's when the fire started. I don't know how it happened. One moment, I was going over the car's specs, and the next, I smelled smoke. Flames were licking up the back wall of the shop, spreading fast. Panic set in as I grabbed a fire extinguisher and started spraying, but it wasn't enough. I ran outside and called 911, my heart pounding as I watched everything I'd worked for go up in flames. The firefighters arrived quickly, but the damage was extensive. The Lamborghini was ruined, along with half the shop. As I stood there, covered in soot, watching the smoldering remains, Amanda pulled up. She stepped out of her car, her face pale but composed. "I heard," she said simply. "It's over," I said, my voice hollow. "The business, everything." "Don't be so quick to give up," she replied, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You've got insurance, and you've got people who believe in you. This isn't the end." The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Telling Charles about the fire was gut-wrenching, but instead of being angry, he offered to help. "We'll rebuild," he said firmly, "bigger and better." His faith in me was like a lifeline. With his support and the help of some generous clients who vouched for me, I managed to secure a loan to reopen the shop. This time, I made it fireproof. The reopening was a huge success. Clients returned, business boomed, and I even expanded into new services like custom interiors and advanced tech upgrades. The fire taught me something important. No matter how much you achieve, there will always be setbacks. But those setbacks don't define you. It's how you respond that matters. For the first time, I started to think about the future in broader terms. I wanted to create a legacy, not just for myself, but for others like me. Kids who grew up feeling stuck, dreaming of something bigger. I began hosting free workshops for teens from low-income families, teaching them the basics of mechanics and car restoration. Seeing their faces light up reminded me of myself at their age, and it felt good to give them a chance to dream bigger. The day started like any other. I was at the shop, working on a sleek vintage Mustang for a client, when I got a call from Katie. "You've got to come home," she said, her voice trembling. "Mom's not feeling well." Panic set in immediately. I dropped everything and raced to the house I'd bought for them, just a few miles from the city. When I got there, Mom was sitting on the couch, pale but smiling weakly. "I'm fine, Michael," she said, brushing me off. "Katie's just overreacting." Katie shot me a look that said otherwise. After a trip to the doctor and a battery of tests, it turned out Mom was dealing with stress-related fatigue. The diagnosis wasn't life-threatening, but it was a wake-up call for all of us. That scare made me realize that while I had been providing for my family financially, I hadn't been present enough. I promised myself I'd change that. Around the same time, the workshops I'd started for teens began gaining traction. Word spread, and before long, I was invited to speak at schools and community centers. Sharing my story, how I'd gone from a bullied kid in a small town to a millionaire entrepreneur, was humbling. One day, after a particularly moving session with a group of high schoolers, a kid approached me. He was shy, barely meeting my eyes, but he finally worked up the courage to speak. "Do you think someone like me could do what you did?" he asked. Looking at him, I saw a younger version of myself, nervous, unsure, but filled with potential. "Absolutely," I said. "It won't be easy, but if you're willing to work hard and believe in yourself, you can do anything." That year marked 5 years since I'd left my small town. To celebrate, I threw a party at the shop, a massive gathering of friends, family, clients, and employees. Charles, of course, was there, looking as proud as a father watching his son graduate. During the toast, I stood in front of everyone, holding a glass of champagne. "When I was a kid," I began, "I spent most of my time in a dusty old garage, dreaming of a better life. Back then, I didn't think it was possible. But thanks to people who believed in me, my mom, my sister, Charles, and all of you, I'm standing here today, living a life I couldn't have imagined." The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time, I felt like I'd truly made it. A week later, I decided to visit my old hometown. It had been years since I'd set foot there, and part of me felt like I needed closure. Driving down those familiar streets in my Aston Martin was surreal. The diner where Mom used to work was still there, and so was the supermarket. I stopped by the old service station, now under new management. But the most emotional moment came when I visited the house where it all began. The garage where I'd spent countless hours tinkering was still standing, though it looked more run down than I remembered. As I stood there, memories came flooding back. The sound of tools clinking, the smell of motor oil, and the voice of my dad teaching me the basics of mechanics. I left a note on the front door for the new owners, offering to buy the house if they ever wanted to sell. I didn't need it back for myself, but I wanted to preserve it as a reminder of where it all started. Life didn't slow down after that. The shop continued to grow, and I eventually expanded into custom car manufacturing. The workshops turned into a full-fledged program, partnering with schools to give underprivileged kids a chance to learn valuable skills. As for my family, Katie finished her degree and started her own business, a boutique bakery that became wildly successful. Mom, now retired, spent her days gardening and spoiling her grandkids. And me? I finally found balance. I worked hard but made time for the people I loved. I traveled, gave back to the community, and even started a foundation in my dad's name to support young mechanics. Looking back, it's incredible to think about how far I've come. From a bullied teenager in a small town to a millionaire entrepreneur, my journey has been anything but ordinary. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No matter where you start, your past doesn't define your future. What matters is the drive to keep moving forward, even when the odds are stacked against you. And for that, I'll always be grateful.